Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for the beginning of Chapter 19, Section 1, Going to War in Vietnam. And to start with, I want to talk a little bit about um, Vietnam and Indochina, just so you kind of have a little background of what's going to happen here. But during World War II, the Japanese had invaded this region called Indochina. And if you look at your map here, Indochina is basically what would be the present day nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And as a result of that occupation by the Japanese, you saw a kind of a push from within Vietnam for um, independence or nationalism. And really, this had been going on since really 1900. And one of the leaders of this organization, kind of pushing for independence or nationalism, was a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, for the most part, was a Vietnamese man who had pressed for independence, really going back to 1919 during the Versailles Peace Conference. And what he was hoping for is that France would relinquish its control over Southeast Asia. His followers in letter A were people known as the Viet Minh. And as you kind of look at Ho Chi Minh's spelling of the last part of his name and the Viet Minh, uh, maybe that will help you recognize those people who were loyal to him. The first president of the United States to send aid to French forces in Vietnam was Harry S. Truman. Truman was concerned after the end of World War II of concerns about containing communism. And in 1949, as you can kind of see on this timeline, China had fallen to the communist. In 1950, we had the beginnings of the Korean War, and with basically the end of that, in 1953, we had the division of Korea into North and South Vietnam, or North and South Korea, pardon me, and the northern part being loyal to the communist. And so by sending aid, he was kind of hoping that he could keep Vietnam maybe away from the Communist Party. Okay. Letter C. What was the result of the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954? Just so you understand, leading up to that, when the war, Second World War ends, for the most part, the Viet Minh, those followers of Ho Chi Minh, start a little war within the country of Vietnam trying to win its independence. France, for the most part, didn't want to lose its colonial claims and basically deployed troops there in 1946. And so troops from France are going to be there throughout the remaining part of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s. At Dien Bien Phu, for the most part, the French forces were overwhelmed by the Viet Minh. And what ends up happening, Dien Bien Phu was a kind of a little hamlet, little town. It had been occupied by French forces. The Viet Minh, for the most part, were able to cut their supply line. They were able to surround the village, forcing the French to surrender. And as a result of that, the French, for the most part, decided that they were going to withdraw their forces out of Indochina, and we had to kind of determine what was going to happen to this part of the world. So we hold a meeting known as the Geneva Accords. And at the Geneva Accords, what ends up happening is Vietnam is split in half at the 17th line of latitude, or the 17th parallel. Anything north of that, for the most part, would be in the hands of the communists. Anything south would be kind of loyal to the West. So as far as the effect of this, we have the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. In the north, we have the Viet Minh. In the south, we have the pro-Western government. As a result of that, in the south, a new leader is going to be selected, Ngo Dinh Diem. He was, for the most part, an anti-communist. He was an individual who was willing to fight the communist at all times, but he was also Roman Catholic. And that didn't necessarily always suit some of the Vietnamese well. Another requirement of this Geneva Accords is that the country of South Vietnam would have free elections. And the goal of those free elections would be allowing the people of both the North and the South to vote whether or not to reunify under what form of government. The deal is those free elections never took place in the South, and I think the fear was that in the South there would be support for communism, and so we never allowed those elections to take place. What we did do is we increased the amount of aid coming from the United States to support the South Vietnamese to help them crack down on communist sympathizers. So, Roman numeral two, America becomes involved in Vietnam. Who were the Viet Cong? The Viet Cong were basically Vietnamese that were in the southern part of the country, South Vietnam, who, for the most part, formed a guerrilla army that was supported by Ho Chi Minh. For the most part, they were given weaponry and things like that so that they could continue fighting a guerrilla war. Or letter B, what was President Eisenhower's response to the fighting between the Viet Cong and South Vietnam's forces? And his response was he increased aid and sent military advisors, for the most part, to help train the South Vietnam Army. When he kind of initially started this, we had just kind of a handful of advisors that would be there. By the time Eisenhower leaves and we kind of turn into the Kennedy administration, the number of advisors keeps increasing to the point where by the time we get to kind of Kennedy's last year in office in 1963, we probably have a couple thousand advisors that are helping the South Vietnamese army. Letter C, politically, why did President Kennedy need to appear tough on communism? Well, Kennedy was a Democrat, and Republicans had accused the Democrats for losing China back in 1949, and Kennedy didn't want to have the blame for that. And so he kept putting money and soldiers into Vietnam with the hope of appearing tough on communism. Letter D, what event ended the regime of No Dien Diem in South Vietnam? This goes back to about August of 1963. And in August of that year, Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge traveled to Vietnam from the United States, and he learned that Diem's generals had been plotting to overthrow Diem. Henry Cabot Lodge knew that Diem was kind of corrupt, and he kind of expressed sympathy towards the generals and what they were going to do. And so on November 1st, 1963, the military coup takes place. And what ends up happening is Diem, for the most part, he is seized and quickly executed. And unfortunately, this leaves South Vietnam very unstable politically. And on top of that, you note the date, November 1st, roughly 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy is going to be assassinated as well. And this kind of leaves us kind of a certain amount of uncertainty, kind of leading into this whole issue with Diem's coup d'etat, for the most part, is that Diem, for the most part, had banned traditional religious flags for Buddha's birthday. He was a Roman Catholic. He was very tough on the Buddhist, and as a result, many Buddhists protested. Diem's police force killed some Buddhists. Matter of fact, there was a Buddhist monk who protested by dousing his robes in gasoline and setting himself on fire on television. And certainly that had a huge visual impact on people worldwide. Kind of, I guess you could say, at least giving them the picture that Diem was a very corrupt guy. So, letter E, what event gave President Johnson war power to prevent aggression in Vietnam? Well, part of this goes back to something known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. To kind of set this up, this was an incident that took place in August of 64 when the United States Navy reported that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had fired upon two of our American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is kind of near the northern part of Vietnam. A couple days later, a similar event happens. And as a result, the United States carries out some air attacks on North Vietnamese ships and some of their naval facilities. 1964 was also an election year for President Johnson. And again, being a Democrat, he wanted to appear tough on communism. And so pursuing the North Vietnamese became a huge priority. On August 7th, just about 5 days after this initial thing begins, uh, members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, passed this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And what the resolution gives the president is the authority to take all necessary measures to repeal an armed attack against any forces of the United States. In other words, it's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is almost the same power as a declaration of war without a declaration of war. And that's the danger of that. Letter F. What two significant events took place in March of 65? President Johnson began a sustained bombing campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder. And this was against the North Vietnamese forces. And this is also when President Johnson orders the first combat troops into Vietnam. And these troops are going to serve alongside of the South Vietnamese army. Roman numeral number 3. What military method did the Viet Cong use against American troops? And probably the big tactic that they did were non-direct combat experiences, such as using ambushes, booby traps, and guerrilla tactics, all of which were incredibly effective, especially the fact that we were fighting a war in a jungle. And they knew the lay of the land. I mean, they had the home field advantage throughout this war. Letter B. How did American forces try to counter the Viet Cong's ability to hide in the thick jungles? We used some different tactics. We used search and destroy missions, which required smaller groups of armed forces going into the jungle looking for these guerrillas. We also started using napalm. Napalm, for the most part, is like jellified gasoline that explodes on contact. Vietnam isn't the first war that we use napalm. Matter of fact, you can go back and look at World War II, and there's plenty of examples of us using napalm during that event. But we also used Agent Orange. Agent Orange is a defoliant that, for the most part, strips the leaves off of trees, making it possible for our aircraft to fly over the three canopy jungle and to be able to see what was happening on the ground. What we do know now is that Agent Orange has been linked to a variety of different types of cancers, and that's been a common issue for a lot of Vietnam veterans. Letter C. Where was the main North Vietnamese supply route? And that was through a network of jungle paths, kind of known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this trail traveled through parts of Vietnam, but it also traveled through Cambodia and Laos. What's interesting is the trail itself was very primitive. It wasn't necessarily a fortified road by any means. What happened towards the beginning of 1970 is we had obviously knew that the Vietnamese were going through Laos and Cambodia, and we started bombing Laos and Cambodia, or at least the regions of that nation or those nations, because of the fact that they were going through those countries. And that angered a lot of Americans because they saw us expanding the war because of that. Letter D. What was one of the main reasons President Johnson refused to order a full-scale invasion of Vietnam, North Vietnam? And part of that was fear about China. It kind of goes back to the Korean War, if you think about it. But if we would have invaded North Vietnam, we probably would have gotten China involved, and we would have escalated the war. Rather than fighting a limited war, we would have been fighting probably a third world war. One thing I do want to mention is like the number of troops. When we talk about, 1965, that was kind of the first year that we started sending troops into Vietnam. 1966, we had about 6,700 Americans who had been killed in Vietnam, with roughly over 200,000 troops already in place at the beginning of the year, and probably by the end of the year, just shy of, or just a little bit over, of 350,000 troops. So the war itself escalated very quickly. Thank you very much.